Hello everyone. So today we are going to listen to the second part of the Introduction to Cultural Studies. Part 2 explains the origin of cultural studies, importance of Birmingham School of Cultural Studies and major cultural theorists of the age. Let us now look at the origin of cultural studies. Cultural studies developed during 1950s in Britain against liberal humanism and orthodox Marxism, the two prevalent attitudes of the time. Liberal humanism was those approaches that gave importance to human beings, and orthodox Marxism was the basic Marxism. Now, cultural studies was rooted in the new left Marxism. It drew upon the literary studies of Matthew Arnold and F.R. Lewis. In Arnold's famous work, Culture and Anarchy, he gave a lot of importance to high elite culture. F.R. Lewis gave importance to great tradition, defining the greatest works that laid the foundations of European literature. None of them looked up to the values of popular culture. They looked down on popular culture as it was contaminated by capitalism. The growth of cultural studies is linked to the rise in interest in popular culture in Western societies in 1960s. From here, pioneers in Britain like Richard Hoggart and Raymond Williams took up the discussions on cultural studies. Now, Richard Hoggart set up the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham School. They focused on working class, dissident youth population, television personalities, and audiences. Richard Hoggart and Raymond Williams carried their own working class backgrounds into their interpretation of culture when they found that their culture, the working class culture, had no role in the literary studies at Oxford or Cambridge. The emphasis is on high culture. This emphasis on high culture meant a certain alienation for these students who come from working class backgrounds. So they pioneered new approaches to culture during the 50s and 60s. The new movements and cultural identities like gay, race-based, feminist, etc. formed certain identities that were politicized, but such attempts had no academic attention. Popular culture became the scene of the struggle. Hoggart's book Use of Literacy, which was published in 1957, and Raymond Williams' book Culture and Society, which was published in 1958, were considered the founding text of cultural studies. Now, Richard Hoggart founded CCCS, that is Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in University of Birmingham in UK in 1964 and became the first director of it. Hoggart later appointed Stuart Hall as his assistant, who later went on to become the director of CCCS by 1971. By the late 1900s, restructuring of university led to the elimination of the Center of Contemporary Cultural Studies. Early approaches of Raymond Williams during the 70s was Marxist and theoretical insights from post-structuralism to develop cultural studies. The early approaches took the debate in the direction of textuality, where culture, identity, and even the nation were seen as texts and narratives. Later, a course named U203 was developed. This U203 was a one-year interdisciplinary course on popular culture offered by Open University UK between 1982 to 87. This course was directed by Tony Bennett and evaluated by Terry Gilton, Raymond Williams, etc. Aim of the course was to interrogate critically the part that popular culture plays within your life. Stuart Hall's 1980 essay, Cultural Studies, Two Paradigms, which was taught in the course, suggested that subjects were not constitutive and culturally expressive. Subjects and expression are both determined by structures of social signification. So these structures of social signification are those structures with power. So this structure is hegemony. Hegemony is an ideological structure that enables the dominant classes to legitimize, naturalize, and retain power. It is the idea that the ruling class can manipulate the value system of a society so that their view becomes a world view. It means the domination of one group over another, like how we see patriarchy as a hegemonic power over women. In Stuart Hall's essay, Encoding and Decoding, which was published in 1973, encoding refers to the production of a message using verbal and non-verbal signs, while decoding is a negotiation of the receiver with the text based on his cultural background. Meanings within text like songs, paintings, television soaps, so these are different texts, and meanings within these texts are organized through the operation of certain codes. The apparatuses, relation, and practices of production appears as symbolic vehicles within language. Hall further illustrates this with the example of a television news. In a case of how a television news is created, that at first we have a raw historical event. Now this raw historical event is first made into a story to become a communicative event. Hall is arguing for attention to the language norms and rules of signification which code the event into a story for audiences to interpret. He views this process as the circuit of culture. So, the process described like first, the institutional structures of broadcasting constructs a message. That is, there's a raw historical event or a news event, and the structures of broadcasting construct a message from the event. These structures then yield the encoded message in the form of a meaningful discourse. It now reaches the audience who decode the message and gets the meaning of the event narrated. The decoded message influences people's sentiment, thinkings, ideology, politics, and behavior. That is, the message has an effect on the structures on the audience side of the circuit. And very short words, we can say that how this culture is very much produced and is totally about power. Now, let us look at a few prominent figures in cultural studies. First, let us talk about Richard Hoggart. He came from a working class background. He tried to privilege organic working class culture over mass culture. Standardization was a feature of mass culture. Instead, he privileged organic working class culture. It is natural. He discussed the changes that happened to the working class culture. His most important work is Uses of Literacy, Aspects of Working Class Life, which was published in 1957. This book tries to understand the changes in culture in Britain due to the influence of mass media, like how the influence of mass media changes working class culture in 50s and 60s. It recalls lost working class culture in England because of massification, that is, the influence of mass media. It attacks the impact of post-war consumer culture. Consumer culture is mass standardization. Everybody becomes the same under mass consumer culture. Now, Richard Hoggart was not the only one speaking about working class culture. There is E.P. Thompson, who was born in 1924 and died in 1993. He's a British historian and a New Left scholar. His most important work is The Making of the English Working Class, that was published in 1963. It talks about the development of working class in 18th and 19th century. This book became the first systematic study of the history of the working class. E.P. Thompson looked at the working class consciousness and he defined social class as a relationship with the other classes, not as a social structure which is already there. Now, we talk about the great cultural theorist Raymond Williams. He was also born into working class in Wales in UK. So he was also born into working class in Wales in UK. He was also a New Left theorist. His first major book is Culture and Society, which was published in 1958. He attacks the notion of culture studies, which gave a lot of importance to high culture, which had prominence from the time of Arnold. People before did not give importance to popular culture. Williams asserted that culture is a way of life. He asserted that culture is lived culture. How people live their everyday life is the real culture. In his work, Long Revolution, Williams states that three cultures exist at a particular moment: dominant culture, residual culture, and emergent culture. Dominant culture is the predominant culture existing in a society. That is a culture that is clearly visible in the attitudes of society. Like, for example, we have capitalism. Now, residual culture is a trace of older culture in modern culture. That is, we got some traits of the older culture that was prevalent then. Like, for example, we have feudalism. Then in emergent culture, it is those new cultural practices that was constantly created in modern cultures, like those counter-cultural movements, like how examples like beat culture in America, or maybe the freak culture that we have today. Now, Williams, in his work Marxism and Literature, which was published in 1977, introduced the term cultural materialism, which is a method of criticism rooted in Marxism and stresses the interactions between cultural artifacts like language and literature and their socio-historical context. Language and literature should not be understood in isolation, but in the historical context that they were developed. So this term, cultural materialism, is really important for cultural studies. Let us now talk about Stuart Hall. He is a Marxist sociologist and cultural theorist. He was the founder of the influential journal of New Left Review. Stuart Hall's model of communication identifies 4 stages of communication, where we have the production of a message, circulation of the message in oral or written manner, use, that is consumption of the message is meaningful, and at last we have reproduction, that is the effect of the message leading to some action. For example, we have the advertisements of fairness cream. So first, when the advertisements of fairness creams are produced and when they are circulated as in different forms of media, it propagates the idea that fair is beautiful. That is a message on the basis of which these ideas or these advertisements propagate. So that forms the production and circulation of the message. And now the idea that you consume after watching the ad is that only if you're fair, you can be confident, you can be successful. Now that is the use of the message, and the effect of which you go and buy the product and use the product is the reproduction of the message. Now, Stuart Hall asserts that culture has a central role in representation. No text has a single permanent meaning. There are multiple or shifting meanings to images. Power structures doesn't allow interpretation of meanings but to fix meanings. For example, if you take a religious text, the religious people did not allow common people to interpret religious text. These patriarchal power structures created different stereotypes. So, now we have come to the end of our presentation. We have discussed the origin of culture studies, how Birmingham School and CCCS were founded and contributed to the growth of culture studies, and we have also quickly seen the most important cultural theorists like Raymond Williams, Richard Hoggart, Stuart Hall and E.P. Thompson. Thank you for listening.